Lawson has a great quote in this paper. He says in the conclusion, it's like one sentence: the requirements for a useful thermonuclear reactor are quite severe. But it's really that paper that has set the tone for the entire fusion endeavor of humanity over the last 70 years.
Hi, Sam. It's great to have you on the podcast. Thanks for taking the time to catch up.
Yeah, I really appreciate the opportunity. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Amazing. So today I want to talk about how we measure progress in fusion. Fusion is deeply complex and technical, and there are a lot of nuances and diversity around how people think about this. And I know you've done a lot of work and thinking over the years, so I want to deep dive into this. And before we jump in, I want to hear a bit about your background. So I know you've straddled various different domains in your career, and you've had some really interesting stepping stones along the way. So it would be great for you to kick off in setting that foundation for us.
Sure. Yeah. So I got interested in fusion, I think, in college, and I ended up going to grad school for physics at University of Colorado at Boulder, and I worked in a lab there that was working on a fusion experiment. It was a field reverse configuration experiment called the Colorado FRC that we actually built from scratch between 2004 and 2006. And it was a great experience. I learned a lot about electronics and welding vacuum vessels and CAD, and it was a good time. It was great. A lot of the time I spent was on electronics. We were building data acquisition amplifiers, and so I did it for 2 years. Around that time, the funding for fusion in the U.S., especially for like alternate concepts like the FRC, they were getting squeezed. And through some conversations with a friend of mine from college, my friend Andre, we started thinking about other things to do besides physics grad school. He was in grad school at Berkeley, and we read some essays by Paul Graham, which came out around that time, around how to start a startup. And we just got this idea that we should try to start a company together. And we kicked around a number of ideas. And one of the ideas that came up was like an exchange for scientific equipment. But we quickly realized that all of this stuff had property tags, and the red tape was going to be a big issue. And then one day he called me up and he said, Sam, I'm spending all my time looking for electronic parts in these gigantic catalogs. And I look over and I have the same catalogs on my desk. And he suggested that we build like a search engine for electronic parts. And I thought, "Well, that sounds like a lot of work. How are we going to like enter in every single piece of data from this catalog into a database?" And so he convinced me that we could try to like scrape the PDF of the catalogs, because DigiKey had started to let you download the PDF of their whole catalog. We actually tried doing that. It didn't work, but then we noticed that you could just go to the websites and start crawling the websites. And we played around with Python. So we started writing Python crawlers to crawl the websites of like all the electronic component distributors. And we didn't know what a database was. We didn't know what a web server was, but we quickly kind of learned about that stuff while we were in grad school. And it was kind of this nights and weekends project. And we kind of became obsessed with it. And we would stay up until like 2 o'clock in the morning. And we had this Linux server that I bought some desktop computer at a yard sale for $50. I put it on my desk. We installed Linux. He was in Berkeley. I was in Boulder. He would log in, and we would like in the terminal like chat on like YTalk and try to like learn about all this stuff. It was a very exciting time. So it's like an adventure. And we applied to Y Combinator at the end of 2006 and got into the winter 2007 Y Combinator batch. And around that time, a little before that time, I decided that that for me, grad school probably wasn't the right path, and so I withdrew, and then we got into YC, and I moved out to the Bay Area in the beginning of 2007, and moved onto his couch, and we started just writing software full time, and that's how Octopart got started. Really quickly, around that time, Andre recruited his friend Harish, who's also in physics grad school at Berkeley. I should say their full name. So Andre More, Harish Iverwalt, and me, we started Octopart, and that whole story is like, good story, interesting story. But in a nutshell, the first couple of years were pretty rough. We had a hard time figuring out how to how to make business deals, how to get traffic to the website, a lot of technical challenges, but it took time. And in the end, it turned into, a company that worked. People started using the website. They found it useful. We struck deals with the component distributors, and we moved the company to New York around the end of 2009, early 2010. And we grew the company in New York. And in 2015, we sold it to an Australian company called Altium. And Altium makes software for printed circuit board design. And as part of the deal, I went to work at Altium for the first year, continuing to work on Octopart. And then after that, doing corporate development, helping them acquire companies. And we did a few deals, and it was a great experience. I enjoyed working there. I learned a lot. It's a publicly traded company. It was, at least on the Australian Stock Exchange, and I had a chance to travel a couple of times to Sydney and kind of learn about how public company works and what that cadence looks like. So it was a good experience. After 3 years, I decided to leave and see what could be done in fusion. So I never stopped being interested in fusion. It was just kind of in the background for that during that time. And I decided to just show up at the American Physical Society Division of Plasma Physics meeting in Milwaukee. And I just showed up just to try to learn what was going on in fusion, what was happening with FRCs. And when I was there, I ran into a startup company. I saw there was a startup company working on fusion, which seemed crazy to me. I wasn't aware of General Fusion or TAE at the time, but there was a company called Hyperjet Fusion that had a booth. And I just went up and I started chatting with them. And that's kind of like how I started reconnecting with the fusion ecosystem. And then there's a whole story from there. But that's the background story, how I re-engaged with the fusion world.
What a journey. It's incredible kind of starting with those plasma physics beginnings and actually getting hands-on experience with machines and then kind of going on this side quest and then coming back to fusion. So it sounds like you've acquired a lot of interesting experiences along the way that's kind of, compounded to where you are now.
Yeah, yeah. Looking back in retrospect, it's like this nice story you can kind of tell on a podcast and people smiling all along. But I have to say, like at the time, I mean, it's just, there was a lot of ups and downs and twists and turns. So yeah, like anything.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. So I know you're deeply passionate about fusion, and one of the areas and what we want to talk a bit about today is about measuring progress. So I know that since you started working back in the fusion space, you've done some work in trying to understand how people should think about progress in fusion. Do you want to talk about the story behind some of the work that you've done there?
Yeah, yeah. So I guess you can jump off right where I left off at that conference. So there's a fusion startup company. They were looking for investors, and I thought, wow, it seemed kind of interesting, a little wild. And so I started, talking to them. I got to know Francis Theo, who was running that company, and we actually went out to dinner. I met him at the conference, and we started talking. And I told him about my background at C Boulder and the FRC, and he said, "Sam, we have to have dinner. We need to talk." So we had dinner, and over dinner, he mentioned that he was actually the program manager for my project when I was at Boulder, and so he knew my advisor, Tobin Munsat, and so we were able to kind of, yeah, we had this funny connection. And so around that time, I was also thinking about fusion startups and about what I'd seen in the Bay Area and in the startup world. And when we started Octopart, it was 2006, 2007 timeframe. And that was when like social media companies were kind of just coming up, and then I saw like the SaaS world kind of emerge. And one thing I realized is that, and that we also talk about a lot of Octopart, is like, what are the key metrics? Like what are the metrics for Octopart? What are the metrics for a SaaS company? What are the metrics for a social media company? In particular, metrics that investors care about. So for example, like for a SaaS company, like you need to know what's like the lifetime value, what's like the churn rate. There's like very standard metrics, and how many monthly active users. So I thought to myself, okay, what I noticed was that the investors that understood the metrics were the ones that were successful, that invested first. And I remember that when Facebook came up, a lot of people said this is like, this is dumb. It's never going to make money. Whoever invests in this is going to lose their shirt. and it was similar with SaaS companies, but it was really the investors that understood the metrics the soonest were the ones who were able to allocate capital effectively because they kind of understood what knobs needed to turn to drive growth. So I remembered from grad school that there were physics metrics for fusion plasma, and I remembered this idea of the Lawson criteria. It was just kind of stuck in my head. And so around that time, I pulled down like all of my plasma physics textbooks and my fusion textbooks. Luckily, I kept them. And I just started like reading them, reviewing them, and reminding myself of like, what the Lawson criteria is. And so we should talk a little bit about the Lawson criteria. Basically what I did is I started aggregating whatever metrics I could find like in a Google Doc, in a spreadsheet. And that was like my first kind of attempt to try to evaluate how near or far are these experiments that are being done by both by companies, by some of the startups, and by some of the university labs or national lab level facilities. I just was trying to understand that.
So going back, you mentioned some of the core metrics. You mentioned the Lawson criterion. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about that and also explore maybe some of the other metrics that you were tracking in this spreadsheet.
So the Lawson criteria, it actually has like a longer title. So let me take a step back. So in 1955, this engineer from UK, his name was J.D. Lawson. He was working at on the Zeta machine, I think, which was the fusion machine at the time, and he was trying to evaluate, is this thing ever going to like make net energy? And what he did was that he wrote down a straightforward power balance analysis of a fusion plasma. And he published it first in 1955 as a classified document with the title, Some Criteria for a Useful Thermonuclear Reactor. And so that's where the Lawson criteria comes from. It's actually criteria for a useful thermonuclear reactor. And so thermonuclear means just a fusion machine where the fusion happens because of high temperature. That's why they use that word. So I downloaded it. It was declassified in 1957, and in 57 he wrote another paper with pretty much the same content in a journal, and it was published. And if you read that paper, which I really recommend every fusion interested person read, it's a wonderful short paper. It's typewritten, and what Lawson concluded was that by doing this power balance, he showed a couple things. One, he showed that in an idealized situation, that there are two things you need to achieve that affect the gain of a fusion system. Okay, so we should define what we mean. So the gain is a ratio of the fusion power to the heating power that's absorbed by the plasma. Okay, and he called it R. Now we call it Q. But and what he found is that there's two knobs that affect that. It's the temperature of the plasma, in particular of the fuel ions. And then the second thing that it depends on is the product of the density of those ions times how long energy stays in the system. So in his formulation is actually the pulse duration, because he had a very idealized formulation of it. But it really depends on those two things separately and independently, and they both matter: the temperature and the product of the density and how long energy stays. So I read that paper very carefully, and so I started thinking about that. And so you asked me, what was in this Google Doc I was putting together? Well, it was those three quantities, but really I had there's really two columns. So the ion temperature, and then the product of these two quantities, density, how long energy stays in there. And it turns out that it was actually kind of tricky to get this data. So I was talking to the folks at Hyperjet in particular, and they were starting to do some of these experiments, but at the time they weren't at the point where they were actually making measurements of these quantities. They were building an experiment called PLX, which was at Los Alamos National Laboratory. And around the same time, I met the main scientist working on that, who was Scott Shue. And the first time I met Scott, I remember, I think it was either at that conference or maybe at another conference, but Francis introduced me to him. And I was thinking about maybe making an investment. And I think Scott was thinking, wow, like it's, they're starting to look for investors. And I think that it was just kind of the beginning of of getting investors involved in fusion. I should at this point mention Malcolm Handley, who really was the first person at this time. So there had been earlier fusion investment, but he started the first VC fund that was only investing in fusion. And and so at the time we all were kind of in this world, I met Scott, I was meeting Malcolm, and I was kind of promoting this idea that we should be tracking this metric of the temperatures and then the n tau, what they call it, the density times how long energy stays in the system. So I mentioned this to Scott, and Scott thought this was a good idea, but we didn't get too much of it into it together until a little bit later. But what I was doing around 2019 is I started reading a lot of fusion papers. So I started downloading every paper I could find, and I was trying to make these graphs to kind of just orient myself. Like, is this real? Are we anywhere near achieving temperatures and taus that are going to get us high enough gain that's useful for a fusion system that makes that energy? And I did kind of a first pass, like a first survey over historical experiments and pretty much anything I could find. And then in early 2020, there was a conference in the UK on inertial fusion energy. And I decided to go to that. And this was in March of 2020. And I showed up there, and there was all this COVID stuff was just kind of bubbling up. But I met up with Scott, and I think Andrew Holland from the Fusion Industry Association was there too. But maybe that was later. Maybe I'm getting things mixed up. But I definitely talked to Scott at that conference, and I showed him my latest version of my graphs, and I showed him the latest spreadsheet that I had. I had this probably had a stack of papers that I printed out. And Scott looked at this, and then he said to me, Sam, like, we should really write a paper about this. We should, take this really seriously and try to get something in the peer-reviewed literature that reviews this progress and also treats the fusion companies that were popping up on the same, against the same metrics. And I said, yeah, that sounds good. It sounds like a couple months project. I'll kind of buckle down, and maybe by like early summer we'll submit it to a journal. And he said, yeah, that sounds reasonable. And that was a pretty fateful conversation because after that conference, well, one, all of the airports started shutting down, and I remember, heading over to the airport and in London, and I think it was as at Heathrow, and it was like it was kind of everybody was trying to make sure they got on like this last. Everybody kind of knew that the flights were going to stop. I got on one of the last flights, flew back to New York, and I just kind of set myself up to do this in a more serious way, and I started reading more about the Lawson criteria. There are things I still didn't quite grasp at the time about it, but I buckled down, and then the pandemic hit, and I was locked down for a while, and so it just became my day-to-day thing. I was working on this pretty much full time, and we started drafting this paper, and that's how this paper got started. Incidentally, we didn't actually publish it until the summer of 2022, so it was really a 2-year long odyssey. And that year also, I joined ARPA-E. So Scott pointed this opening at ARPA-E out to me. So Malcolm Handley actually had gone to work at ARPA-E as technology to market advisor for the fusion programs there. And right after that meeting in the UK, Scott joined ARPA-E as program director, taking over from Pat McGrath. And Scott then got the beta program going and the gamma program going. And I joined in the in spring of 2021. And we continued to work on the paper as a sideline while we were at ARPA-E together. And it came out in like, I think April or in the spring of 2022.
So bringing us back to talking about the paper and we're focusing on some of the metrics you were talking about. When you have this Excel spreadsheet, there's two questions. So one is around the act of trying to normalize many of these configurations and design. We know that Fusion has a lot of technological diversity across configurations, architectures. Can you give a bit of a scale to, how many data points are we talking about? Where are you actually fishing for these data points? How does that work?
Yeah, so I should say the title of the paper is Progress Towards Fusion Energy Breakeven and Gain as Measured Against the Lawson Criteria. So it's a bit of a mouthful. And one of the challenges you point out is how do we put all of these fusion experiments on an equal playing field? Because in fusion, you have magnetic confinement fusion, which is relatively low density plasmas where you try to hold the energy in for a long period of time. And in inertial confinement systems, you have very high density fusion plasmas, but the energy stays in there for a very short amount of time. And as Lawson showed, it's the product of these two things. So they can be traded off in equal measure. And then in the middle, you have like intermediate density regimes where the energy stays in for like an intermediate amount of time. So that's kind of like at a high level how you unify these two sides. But there's something a little bit more subtle that I've kind of glossed over, which is when I've been saying this phrase, how long energy stays in the system. So maybe I'll just say in a little bit more detail about what I mean by that. So in a magnetic confinement system, energy leaks out of the system in a couple of ways. One is just through X-rays. It's called Bremsstrahlung. And that's pretty well understood. It's a function of the temperature, how hot it is. And it goes like temperature to the 1/2 power. But it turns out that energy, leaks out in other ways, so through thermal conduction. And it's just something that you characterize. And it's characterized by something called the energy confinement time. So the energy confinement time it's a time for how long it takes energy to leak out of the system through ways that you have not accounted for in the power balance. So typically in the power balance, you account for the X-rays, but there's thermal conduction, and so it's a characteristic time of of really any fusion plasma. But there's another time which is how long that fusion plasma exists. Okay, it's like how long do you sustain the plasma for the pulse duration? It turns out that for magnetically confined systems, the energy confinement time, which is like the energy leaking out time, tends to be a lot shorter than the pulse duration. And if you do the algebra, and in our paper, it goes through this algebra, it shows that it's really the shorter of those two times that matters. It's almost like this is probably as into the weeds I'll get, but it's almost like resistors in parallel. So if you take in high school physics, you remember that the way you evaluate the resistance of resistors in parallel is that it's the reciprocal of the sum of the reciprocals. And it turns out that the same mathematical formulation falls out of the power balance. And we kind of saw this ourselves as we were uh, generalizing Lawson's formulation, which was a little bit different. Lawson's formulation assumed that there was no leaking out of the energy. It just assumed that there was a fixed pulse duration, which is actually closer to the inertial confinement scheme. So in laser fusion, for example, take lasers and you compress a small sphere of fusion fuel, and the only thing holding it together is the inertia of the fuel itself. So it kind of squeezes in and then it flies apart. And so the time that it is confined is very short. But it turns out that the time that energy leaks out is actually longer than that. So in the inertial confinement scheme, it's the pulse duration that matters. In magnetic confinement, it's really the energy confinement time that matters. And when you're in this in-between region, they both kind of matter if they're on the same order of magnitude, right? So it's actually kind of a beautiful formulation because the algebra is just super clean. And so in our paper, we did come up with this, we described this term, we call it tau effective. So it's really the smaller of the two. And so we just use the energy confinement time for magnetic systems. We use the time that it was inertially confined for the inertially confined systems. And in the paper, we didn't have too many of these in-between ones, but the way you would do it is by taking the reciprocal of the sum of the reciprocals. It's kind of like they both matter. And then the other piece of it, which is the temperature, that's just a measurement that you can make. Like as long as the distribution of the ions is like thermal, like there's some time that they become a well-defined temperature, then that can be measured. And there's ways that you can measure that, and it gets reported in the literature. So what Lawson did is he realized that, and then he said, okay, well, what does the temperature have to be, and what does the product of n tau have to be? And it turns out that the temperature, there's a threshold, like it has to be above 4 keV, which is how plasma physicists the units they use for temperature, but it's roughly 50 million degrees, and this is for deuterium tritium fuel. Like you just got to get to 50 million degrees for deuterium tritium, and the product of the density and the energy confinement, or the confinement time, have to be above a threshold. And that threshold, it's less intuitive, so I won't like quote the number. But Lawson has a great quote in this paper. He says in the conclusion, it's like one sentence, like the requirements for a useful thermonuclear reactor are quite severe. And it's like typical, British understatement. But it's really that paper that has set the tone for the entire fusion endeavor of humanity over the last now 70 years. And so, just as a side note, I was in the UK a couple of years ago for an IAEA meeting, and I had kind of become obsessed with this paper, as you can see, and I learned that the original classified document, there was a copy of it on file at the United Kingdom National Archive, which is an amazing facility on the outskirts of London. And so I took an afternoon and I got on the train and I took the train there. And before I'd gone, I made a reservation because you have to like make a reservation. You have to give them all this information. They have to like pull it out of storage. And it was amazing. I got there. I had an appointment and I went up to the desk and then they just, there's a whole reading room and there's people just with all kinds of ancient documents doing academic research. And they gave me this plastic tub and inside of it was an original copy of Lawson's classified document with like a stamp, like classified original. And then there's like another stamp that had been unclassified in 57. And it turned out that the copy that has circulates was like, it's kind of a bad, low quality scan. And actually some of the pages are like cut off on the edges. And I thought to myself, I took pictures of all of the paper. You're allowed to do this. And then I was talking to them and they said, I know this is a tangent, but I can't help myself. They said that they will actually do like an archival scan and you can buy the right because it's like so old, you can buy like a distribution rights for like $35 or something. So that you could just like put it up on your own website. Obviously, like anybody can do this. So I had them do this and I actually have this copy and I've been meaning to like write about it. So this is now that I've kind of put it out there, I will do this. I have like a higher quality version of it that nobody's seen before. And then I have like, right to put on my website and anybody can download it. So anyway, that's just a plug for the National Archives. I really can't thank them enough. It was great. So as you can tell, I got obsessed with this paper and it really formed the basis of our paper. And, Lawson, I think he passed away in 2008. But I kind of feel like, it would have been, I would love to just, yeah, I would love for him to be able to kind of see our paper because it's like we're kind of like linked across, all the decades and everything. Anyway, so yeah, our paper. So what's in the paper? Well, the paper it's a database of data points from, I should know this, maybe 50 data points, maybe 70. I forgot the exact number that's in there. But we really scoured the literature, both historical papers and also like very recent papers coming out of fusion companies. And we also included some of the projections based on the physics basis of experiments that were already under construction. So including ITER and Spark, which was under construction by CFS and is still under construction. And then in 2025, we actually updated the paper. We put out an update last year. And yeah, I kind of have this ambition to kind of keep it going with Scott. Just in a nutshell, after we put it out, it kind of became a reference for investors because it was this paper that nobody was really incentivized to write. There was no new physics, except for maybe a new formulation of the Lawson criteria, but it really was one of these papers that nobody was going to get a PhD by writing. Nobody was going to get like tenure, but it was going to be really valuable for the fusion community. So it kind of made sense for us to do it while we were employed by the Department of Energy at ARPA-E. It was like this public service for the fusion community, and we heard from investors that they found it really useful. So the paper, the way it's structured, is that the introduction and the conclusion and the graphs I think are digestible by any interested person, and then like the middle is kind of a lot of like physics justification, which if you really want to get into the weeds, you can get into it, but we submitted it to peer review and we made a few small corrections to it. And I think there'll be, hopefully we'll put out a third, version. We got to figure out what we're going to do. But it was a great experience. I learned a lot and it was great to work with Scott on it all this time.
So when you did the analysis, you've set assumptions, you made this adjusted criteria, you normalized, you're up to interpreting the data. Was there any interesting insights that came from doing that activity? You've populated the graphs, you're looking at their profiles. What did you think?
Yes, it was very interesting. So there's a metric that, and this will make sense shortly. So I mentioned that there's two numbers that matter, right? And one of those numbers is the product of two numbers. And it turns out that if you multiply all three of those numbers together, you get like a figure of merit. Okay. It's like, it's kind of one number to just look at one number. Now we can draw graphs of that number over time. And so we call the number the triple product because it's the product of the temperature of the ions, the density of the ions, and how long energy stays in the system. You can't go from just that number to the gain level. And in fact, Lawson never said anything about the triple product, right? But there's a paper that came out in the 70s where they started using it as a figure of merit. And that was the first reference I could find of the triple product. I don't recall off the top of my head, but we do have it as a reference in the paper. The author, the title of that paper, but it's a good figure of merit. And what we did is we graphed the triple product of the record triple product of different fusion concepts over time. And that graph has, I think that's kind of like the graph that got investors, it was helpful to investors, right? They could kind of see progress over time. You roughly see, based on assumptions of temperature, where you would have to get to achieve certain levels of gain. And one thing that was really interesting is that inertial confinement fusion, in particular the NIF, had very high triple products, but was also close to like a contour that we thought would reach ignition. And just a short story there is that we're really grateful, I think, to the plasma physics community, because I sent a lot of emails at that time, like asking, like, does this make sense? And I sent, and through a lot of Scott's connections, we were able to kind of get in touch with everybody. And I sent an email to Ricardo Betti, who was involved in it's with a theory around the NIF, and I showed him this graph, and I had a picture of like this ignition contour, and there were some corrections that we were kind of going through, and there's all kinds of details about different corrections we had to make, but it showed a NIF shot from, I think from like 2015 or 16 or maybe 17, that was like really close to the ignition contour. I was like, is this right? Like, is NIF really this close to ignition? And this was like right around, this was not long before August 8th, 2021, which was when NIF actually achieved hotspot ignition. So it was before the official ignition shot. There's details about definitions of ignition, but it was N210808, which was the shot taken on August 8th, 2021. And it crossed that contour. And so actually we saw that NIF was close. We kind of knew that NIF was close just by drawing these contours and these curves. Obviously the NIF folks knew this, right? But I don't think it was like that as well appreciated until that huge achievement that they made. Other interesting stuff from the graph was seeing how performant the maglev experiment really was, which I think was also kind of underappreciated. And so, I downloaded these maglev papers and we kind of put them on the plot, and I talked to folks at Sendia and Z Machine, and then I actually heard recently, from the Pacific Fusion folks who are actually pursuing a maglev type of concept, like a pulse power experiment, that those graphs were helpful as they went to their investors and they raised $900 million for Pacific Fusion. So that's just one example of how this graph kind of just laid out the whole landscape. And it's not like this was not known, right? It was in the literature, but I think just sometimes like putting it all together can help tell the story.
So moving on to impact of the paper, you've spoken about a really kind of concrete example where the paper has had incredible leverage in the order of billions and likely exceeding that threshold. What are some of the other impacts that you've seen once this paper's kind of been out in the wild?
I think there's another way I think it's been great, which is that I think it's gotten young people excited about fusion in a way that I don't think existed when I was in grad school. When I went to grad school, I had a mentor whose lab I worked in, during like a summer program, and it was a great experience. It was like a nuclear physics instrumentation lab. And when I told him I wanted to go to physics grad school, and I told him I wanted to work on fusion in 2004, he basically sat me down and he said, "Sam, like whatever you do, don't do plasma physics. It's a dead field. Fusion is never going to happen. You're never going to get a job." And I mean, in some ways, like it was not bad advice. Like I ended up not even finishing grad school, right? At the time, it was not a good time for fusion. But when I was at RPE, I had a chance uh, to to give talks and to visit some universities and to give talks about the paper. And I think that it really does tell the story of this fusion endeavor over time, it really shows that even though people are always saying, "Oh yeah, fusion is 30 years away, it's never going to happen." What this graph shows is that there's been continual incremental progress since the 1950s, really. And I think that's a very compelling story. Uh, and I think that students see that and they get excited about fusion. And then I think they see that energy is really important for a lot of reasons. And we're going to be using more energy. And I think that like some of the most ambitious, brightest students that want to go either into physics or people that want to work in a field where they really feel like it's going to make a difference. I just think that it's attracting like just a whole lot more people now. It's not the paper, obviously, but I think that I have seen students, listen to the talk about the paper and kind of come up to me and ask really good questions about it. So it's like, it's just an observation that I'm making that, ambitious students are getting into fusion. When I was in college, like, the a lot of people were going into tech, going to work at like the tech companies like Google and Facebook, which were very new and exciting at the time. But I think now, energy is really an area where people want to work. So I think that's going back to the paper. I just think like telling the story of fusion over time has been impactful.
Yeah, great. And I think that one of the interesting things is that people have been kind of mapping that graph and trajectory to the Moore's law trajectory, which I think is also really, people have seen that concrete improvement of technical and technological advancement over time, and being able to show that kind of temporal iteration and improvement of fusion has been very impactful. I know that people are using that graph on walls and as murals in their startups, offices. I'm sure some insiders will know about the Lawson cafeteria, things like that.
Yeah. At CFS, I think they printed out a copy of it, and my friend and former colleague at RP, Ahmed Diallo, he emailed me. He's like, "Hey, can you send me like the vector graphics version of the file so I could print it on high quality?" It was pretty easy to do, and I think that he's printed it out and has it on his wall at Princeton Plasma Physics Lab. So, and if anybody wants a copy in that format to print it out, happy to share. Just email me.
Amazing. The other one that I've also seen as a really interesting kind of second order benefit or outcome from the paper is that you spoke about investors, and this has been a really important output for investors to be able to showcase that progress, that it's not just kind of a nebulous threshold that people need to cross. And we've seen, investors that are taking a portfolio approach to fusion that are going, I'm going to invest something in this trajectory of this line of the graph, and I'm going to choose this grouping, and I'm going to invest in a company here to really trade off some of those benefits that you spoke about with regards to, temperature confinement, time and density.
Yeah, definitely. I think that it has informed this idea of like a portfolio approach to fusion investment. And there's one other thing I didn't want to mention, which is that I do think it's also kind of encouraged a lot of companies to be more open about their science and publish both their experimental results and their anticipated or planned physics basis in peer-reviewed uh, plasma physics or scientific journals. And look, I mean, peer review is not it's not perfect. It certainly has its own issues, but it's kind of like the best thing that we've got in science. And I think that I see a lot of companies that have done a great job publishing what they're planning on doing to the point where like I feel like we're already behind, right? Like we need to catch up with some of the recent publications and update some numbers. But I think it's yeah, like to get on the plot, we try to keep it to peer reviewed publications, wherever we can. I mean, in some of the older things, we had to make exceptions here and there, and we try to indicate that. But really, we want to encourage the sharing of the scientific information, and the reason is because this stuff is like really tough, right? Plasma physics is tough, and by publishing in journals, you get the entire plasma physics community globally. You get their eyes on the problem and on the situation, and I think that scientific exchange, both like over emails and at conferences, is something that I've witnessed in fusion over the last couple of years, and I think it's amazing. People have really good ideas; they're able to point out your errors, and I just think it's like that's like science at its best. And I think bringing that to bear on this really tough challenge is something that we've tried to advocate for.
So what's next for you with regards to progressing from this study and doing further analysis as fusion matures?
Yeah, so I left RPE in 2024, and since then I've been working on a few things. So last year we updated the paper. I've been working on a website called fusionenergybase.com. It's a clearinghouse for information about the fusion energy ecosystem, and we're working on turning that into a business. We have a database that has information about all the fusion companies, all of their investors, all of their fundraising rounds. We have a supply chain directory. We have the best fusion jobs board out there if you're looking to get involved in the field. Basically, the mission statement that I've been kicking around lately is that the goal is to help people within the field to understand who is working on what with whom, because it's growing. And so it's just important to have that information out there, and then to help people that want to get involved in fusion to understand where they can plug in, because fusion is not just plasma physicists anymore. It needs everybody. It needs engineers, it needs lawyers, it needs welders, it needs government relations professionals, it needs all kinds of stuff, right? And so in our jobs where we have filters for like a lot of different kinds of roles. So I'm working on that. Like I said, we have an affiliate program where supply chain companies can pay and have their products promoted, and we interview them and put them in the newsletter. So, maybe I'll limit my plug to Fusion Energy Base to that. But it's been a great platform also for me to do a bit more writing. In fact, just yesterday we put out a fusion power plant simulator, which lets you look at the power flows in different fusion power plants designs to help understand like how much gain, how much Q do you need for a useful fusion energy system, which according to Lawson's definition of useful is one that makes net electricity that could be sold to the grid. And it shows the trade-offs that you have to make. Like if you have higher conversion efficiency of like electricity into plasma heating, and higher efficiency of the power coming out of the fusion machine into electricity, then you need lower gain, and vice versa. If you have lower efficiencies, you need higher gain. And it shows how those things are traded off using like interactive graphics and like JavaScript widgets that you can use sliders. So no math. And the goal there is to try to help investors and interested people, students, develop an intuition about what are the right questions to ask. Like how much gain does this concept need and why? How efficient is your heating going to be? How efficient is your conversion to electricity going to be? And I'm hoping in the future to do more interactive things like that for what happens in the plasma, for like the Lawson criteria for the temperature and the product of the density and how long energy stays in the system. So that's something I'm hoping to do in the future. And I've been involved in advising some fusion companies and trying to kind of get involved in that world too, and stay relevant and helpful. But yeah, the immediate goal is to get fusion energy base into like a cash flow positive situation, so that could sustain over a long period of time. Because I think fusion, we're going to be doing fusion for a long time, I think. And I think having a central repository of information about it will be useful. It'll help accelerate the industry. And I think that it's a way for me to leverage my background with like the web technologies. Um, that's assuming that like the web is going to exist in like 2 years, like with AI. Who knows? We'll see. But it's also a platform to like learn about what's happening with AI in terms of software development, and that's a whole other conversation.
Amazing. Well, first thing, I just want to, draw listeners, read the paper and have a look at some of these interactive tools that Sam's putting out, because it's a very good way to, hands-on way to be able to play with some of these variables and levers that are really important to fusion performance. And Sam, firstly, I want to thank you for your contributions to the field in helping to assemble this paper with Scott. I think it's a seminal contribution to the industry that's helped, not only the scientific cohort and community, but also the broader, investment and also many people that aren't yet in fusion that will be in the future. I'm sure will put their eyes to the paper. So thank you for that. Thank you for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Well, thanks a lot for having me, and thanks for doing the podcast. I love listening to your earlier episodes, and hope you do a lot more of them.
Thank you, Sam. Have a great day, and we'll talk soon.